Thank you for joining us today, Megan. To start with, could you talk through some of the key concepts that inform IHI, your project at the Sharjah Biennial?
I suppose I wanted to start with talking about the concept of ihi, or the title. So ihi is really a Māori term which means like positive energy. It's really like upbeat, and it's really linked to both the body and well-being as well as things like spirituality. It's quite an essential kind of source, I suppose, and it says in the guidebook that it's a physical rather than a spiritual force. That should have said psychic. So it's a psychic force as opposed to a spiritual force. And it really is about power, but it's really also about magnetism or charm. And so I called the show Ehi because I really I thought it embodied the kind of ethos of the project and a number of the works that have an ehi. An ehi is like it might be a response to something. And it's really like awe or wonder, those kinds of ideas. So I wanted to start so ehi kind of encompassed a whole lot of things. At one stage it was called radiance, which is similar in terms of like things that are positive going out, and it was based on a poem that Daniel Boyd had written called Recalcitrant Radiance, which were almost opposite kind of ideas. One, something that was entrenched and kind of fixed, and something that was very expansive and open. And I like the duality of things. The other key concepts, of course, the idea of land and place is really important to me and to the project. I think because I worked with a large number of First Nations people, but from across, not just from one locality. And the only commonality really between First Nations people is this relationship with land and place, but in an abstract sense rather than necessarily being, you can be of country, but you don't necessarily need to live on country. It's a notion that people carry with them, that there's a particular set of coordinates that you kind of relate to or you come from, or that and different people in this project talk about that. So for example, someone like Kapulani Landgraft, in all her photographs of all the wahikapu or wahitapu, the sacred sites across Maui, she talks about them as ancestral storied landscapes. So landscapes that are filled with ancestral stories and meaning, and that have accumulated over time. And then there's a counter, well, not a counter, but an overlapping kind of idea, which was that geography as structure, because I really didn't want to just kind of bring things and plant them here. I really wanted to think about geography as structure, how geography informs the way in which we might operate and how we might live, and the particular geography of Sharjah, the lands and cultures and people that exist here, and really to look at those synergies or resonances between the ideas and the work that was coming, and those kind of cross-cultural kind of parallels. So that was important. And then the big, large idea, I had so many ideas, it wasn't funny. The big, large idea, because when I first started, humanity is an incomplete project, or Jimmy Durham's kind of adage, I wanted to use that because I liked how broad and expansive it was, and it gave me a very open canvas to kind of work with, and people's relationship to. I wanted to talk about humanity, in its broadest terms, even though, as I said, it comes down further, and I did focus on First Nations artists, not exclusively, however. Humanity is really important to all of us, and the way in which things operate, and the idea that it's incomplete and that we're still struggling to kind of shift and change things. And that's also where that idea of collective restlessness with the status quo came in, because the idea of I think impermanence, I suppose, which is very Buddhist, I suppose, but the idea of impermanence and things constantly changing, and our desire to constantly change things so that we don't stay in the same kind of I don't know, position that we're in, or the things that are wanting to change things for the better, and on behalf of humanity, all of us. And as I said, I like to kind of work in the abstract, and I like working with very big ideas.
I wanted to ask you about some of the organizing principles the five of you established, like the lexicon of terms that you had,
Yeah,
where you had spatial and temporal references like earth, water, or terrain, and also things that were attitudes to practice or
yeah,
structures or formats like radical pedagogy, collectivity, song, lament, or knowledge and wisdom. And I also know that writing is a big part of your professional background and your curatorial work. And from that perspective, I wanted to understand how does this vocabulary of terms lend itself to different kinds of artistic practices, concerns, and mediums? So, could you talk through some of the artists and works you invited to the biennial?
sure. I mean, it was an interesting process. I really, as I said, I really chose artists that I've worked with for a very long time, over a period of like 30 years that I've worked with, and who so I have a deep engagement with their practice, but I admire and respect the work in which they create. So someone like Daniel Boyd, I was interested in I really wanted to do like a site responsive work with him. I want him to kind of activate a space and to shift the meaning of that space in some ways. And of course, that was the flying saucer, um, which is an extraordinary space. And I saw it really as an experiential space. But he talks about all sorts of things. He works with very big ideas, to the point that sometimes I don't understand. I have to ask him, can you explain that again? So, people like Glissant, and the ideas of accumulation, the ideas of opacity, the lenses or oculi that he uses, which he talks about, fragmented knowledge, and about perception and multiple entry and exit points within his work. Also, the idea I like song, and the idea of working with song, and the song, lament, those terms, earth, water, terrain, song, lament, radical pedagogy, collectivity, knowledge, wisdom. They were kind of overlapping concerns. They came out of a very early conversation between the five curators. And I was really interested, and I boiled it down to those simple terms. That the conversations were much denser than that. But I liked those terms, and I felt like they were almost like ways in which I could kind of frame individual works. So it's like this overarching idea: humanity is an incomplete project, and then this relationship with land and place, and the synergy between both the work that was coming in and this place here, so that there was some kind of relationship and an acknowledgement of the local. And then those ones kind of anchored things a bit further. So the work could relate to sometimes more than one of those kinds of ideas. So someone like Michael Parikorwhai, his work is about song, because he talks about the piano as a sculpture filling a space, like the sound of music filling a space like no sculpture could ever. And the reason it feels like it's a little bit dwarfed in that space because it's supposed to be activated more than it has been, and it's supposed to be the sound that fills the space, not necessarily the object. So, and it's ephemeral, it's that idea of impermanence. Kate Newby, whose work is completely site responsive, and she really works with like the ordinary and the everyday, and sometimes things that are unseen. So her response was really, she wanted to work with, like glass. So when you think of Sharjah and sand and silica glass, she wanted to work with marine rope to reference. I was quite surprised, because we did site visits. And I was quite surprised she wanted to take on I thought it was quite a daunting space. And then actually she showed me some pictures later of these wires with blobs on them, which are like electrical wires, where she kind of referenced that. But it was a way of also breaking up the landscape. It was a way to respond to the landscape. She wanted to pick up the colours. She also wanted to create like a giant sundial, so it changes over time. So the shadow of that work is as important as the physical work, the substance of the work, and again, around those ideas of impermanence, she completely played into it. So, I don't know if that's answered your question. There's many more. So someone like Ioane Scarce also works with glass, but in a very different way. She's talking about country with that work. Those yams are related to a food that her family, a traditional or a customary food they would have grown and eaten. And she's talking about the disaster, which is, this nuclear history, or she calls it nuclear colonization, where bombs were dropped in the 50s and 60s in the Maralinga Desert in the race to, make weapons of mass destruction. Everyone was very excited about it, I think. The British and the Australians allowed them to do it without a thought about what was happening to the people that actually lived there. And even if they were moved off that space, they've been in that, 60,000 years old of continuous culture. Now they can't access those lands because they're completely toxic. They can't grow the food. The people who were there got very sick. People died. So her work speaks directly to that, the things that we would like to change and not continue to repeat over and over and over and over. I don't know if we do learn as humans. The world is in a crisis always, it seems. There's wars, there's stuff going on in Sudan, there's stuff going on in Gaza, Ukraine, everywhere. Those threats and those things that are happening on a daily basis around the world that we become aware of, how do we shift and change that? And I feel like, I'm not that art can answer all those questions, but at least people are looking at it and reflecting on it and thinking about it and offering maybe a way through or a different way of living.
You spoke of land and place earlier,
Yeah.
and time, space, and place have a very active presence in many of the works you brought to the biennial. And I'm specifically thinking of the video works by Subhash Tebi Limbu or Luke Willis Thompson, or even the piano and the Michael Parekowai's work, and how the piano really is an object that functions across time, both in its materiality and also in how it's activated
Absolutely.
sound. So I wanted you to talk about that, this relationship between time and place, and also ask you what perspective might speaking from another time or from plural times offer us.
I think a lot of the works kind of collapse time, if you know what I mean, or they don't work with time in a regular sense. Michael's work, of course, is both customary and contemporary. It talks about the history of colonisation in New Zealand and how when the European settlers would come, they'd often bring pianos rather than a chest of drawers with them, for example, because we were the antipodes, we were the back of beyond, and we had no culture. So they would bring culture with them. So he's critiquing and commenting on that practice, but he's also critiquing and commenting about how the piano had been adopted, basically. He made that work initially for the Venice Biennale in 2011 on a project called On First Looking in Chapman's Homer. And he wanted to take something that was recognisable in Italy, but to change it. And then the piano was made, of course, in Padua in something like 1655, which he knew, but he wanted to reimagine it. So what he was really saying in a very wry way was, we've taken your culture, we've reimagined it, and we've made it our own, and now we're sending it back to you in a form that perhaps you haven't seen before. So, I mean, he was saying in another way, saying, at one stage, Europe was the centre in terms of culture, and we were the periphery. He said, now, we've kind of come of age. We're now the centre, and perhaps Europe is the periphery. It's not as significant. I think his work always works across time, and as I said, kind of collapses time. It's a contemporary object, obviously, but it also references a carving tradition that goes way back. As he talks about that object filling the space, like sound or song filling a space, or music filling a space like no object ever could. And so, that he believes that the piano kind of melts away when it plays. Sabash is very much, it was a speculative piece of fiction that again collapsed past and present, had a very historical character meeting a contemporary character who's way off in the future. I suppose, he works with this concept called Adivasi futurism, which is really based on Afrofuturism and then indigenous futurism, and then one that's very specific to his locality, and as an indigenous Nepalese person. And Adivasi, he talked about Dalit communities and wanting to, so it's like regionally specific, but it bounces off those. And I think it's like this, it's very positive. As I said, that's why I liked the word ehi. Luke's the same. Again, it's a piece of speculative fiction that looks at the year 2040 and looks at a complete constitutional change, a move from, this Westminster style of governance in New Zealand, which is a colonial kind of structure that doesn't actually work, to a new form of governance, which has it's like a two-state solution, which has got two houses, one that's an indigenous house and one that's that records the way that things are.